Speaking of this month in my Psych 101 class, as I do often because of Halloween, do a lecture. Um, well, the class chooses if you want the lecture or not. So we'll get to it, but I do a lecture called The Real Monsters That Live Among Us, where we can go over things like psychopathology and serial killing. And I even have the class do a profiling thing in the class. So that's something to think about. We'll probably vote on whether or not we want that or just our regular class in a week or so. But if you're into Halloween, that's always a fun lecture series. Come on. There we go. All right. So this is the topic we have for tonight is we want to get through. Well, I kind of ended with these uh, on the Wednesday before. But these are the three types of learning. These first three are the three types of learnings that we're going to talk about, starting with classical conditioning, which is also known as associative conditioning, and then operant conditioning, where we talk about reward and punishment. And we'll talk about why sometimes it works and why sometimes it doesn't. And then the last topic we have for tonight is what is known as social learning. And as I mentioned on that Monday class before fall break, this is one of those types of learning that is unique to social species like human beings and elephants and some primates species as well, where we can learn a brand new behavior based on observing several other people in our lives or persons in our lives. So it's kind of a unique thing for humans. But we're going to skip this. But the first two types of learning that we need to talk about is associative learning and operant conditioning. Okay. Classical conditioning is when an individual does not need to be actively involved um, to learn something. Okay, so for example, you don't have to behave in some way in order to learn what that means. So, for example, you might associate going to the doctor with pain because last time you were at the doctor, he gave you a shot. I always think in this picture it should be the sound of a dentist drill because every time I hear that zzz noise, my mouth hurts. But it didn't rely on me to learn anything or do anything to learn that behavior. And I'll give you another example here in a minute when we get into kind of the rules and the way classical conditioning work. The second type of learning is operant conditioning, and this is where you could use the word operate means the person has to do something, and then based on the consequences of doing that thing will determine whether or not the person or the little rat or the pigeon will do that thing in the future. Okay. So we'll start with classical conditioning, which, as I mentioned again, the Monday before fall break started with a man named Ivan Pavlov. And I mentioned that we probably should give him more credit for things like antacids than we do for discovering kind of these rules of classical conditioning because he was a physiologist. He was studying the digestive system of animals at that time. And the animals that he was using were dogs. Okay. And just to kind of go through it, what he found is that if a neutral stimulus gets paired with what's called an unconditioned stimulus, it creates a behavior of some type. Okay, so we're going to kind of go through these acronyms. So, an unconditioned stimulus produces an unconditioned response in an animal. So, in this case, the sight or smell of food will naturally create salivation. The dog does not need to learn it. We don't need to learn it when our favorite food is sitting right in front of us and say, oh, I need to start salivating right now. It just happens. Okay. A neutral stimulus is something that does not produce that particular unconditioned response. So usually ringing a bell doesn't create salivation. Okay. But what Pavlov found is that when you pair a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus over and over and over, that produces uh, that produces a both an unconditional response and what this third diagram shows is a conditioned response, where if they're paired enough times, the conditioned stimulus will automatically start to produce that conditioned response, meaning the salivation. Okay. This may require a lot of pairings. So things like phobias or things you get scared of may take a long time to pair with each other. But if the response is strong enough and the unconditioned stimulus is strong enough, then it can only need one time for a pairing for that then new stimulus to create that conditioned response. And I always bring this up. My example of one one pairing is way back. We're talking 2002, somewhere around there. I started to take a new medication, which is what would be considered the unconditioned stimulus, because what my body did is actually had a negative response to it. I got deeply ill, like we're talking explosive everything. I felt like my body was leaving itself everywhere. Okay. Now that's the unconditioned stimulus, that pill, and the unconditioned response is the sickness. Okay. However, the time at which the sickness really hit me, me and my spouse at the time were at our favorite Italian restaurant where I was eating fettuccine Alfredo. Okay. That fettuccine Alfredo with that pill got associated with the sickness. And even today, I have a hard time even being around fettuccine Alfredo. It makes my stomach ill. I can't even get even if I smell it, there's something going on that's wrong. But it was actually that pill that caused that response. But ever since then, I've had a trouble eating things like fettuccine. Okay. Um, to kind of express this a little bit further, things like post-traumatic stress disorders tend to be classically conditioned. Okay. So someone who, if they have a severe enough trauma, such as a car accident or something happening on the military field or a something violent happening to them, they can pair stimuli that has nothing to do with the what happened to them, um, to the harm they received, but those become paired. So it's not uncommon for example, sexual assault victims to not be able to go into the spaces that they used to go into. Certain smells from when that assault occurred can create trauma responses. And this is also why military individuals, once they're out of that military zone, they can still have those re-traumatized experiences by certain stimuli, such as fireworks or something like that going off. Okay. And we best learned this, if you remember, with the little Albert experiment, John B. Watson. If you remember at the beginning of the semester, he wanted to show that phobias were classically conditioned. So just to kind of give you a reminder, here's a little clip from what he did. So let's take a look at this.
To prove that environment is more powerful than genetics, Watson designs an experiment for an infant known as Little Albert. He's so confident, he films it for posterity. At first, Albert shows little fear, even when Watson places a burning newspaper in front of him. Albert is also unafraid when he encounters a white rat for the first time in his life. But then Watson shows Albert the rat accompanied by a loud clanging noise, one of the few things that upsets little Albert. And he does it again. And does it again. Eventually, Albert learns to fear not just the rat, but all furry things, even without the loud noise. In Watson's mind, the Little Albert experiment is a success because it proves that fears are learned, not inherited.
Okay, so that was an example of how it shows that a lot of fears and phobias that we do have tend to be learned, not something that we're born with, certain fears. But the story is much more complicated than that, as we will see later in the course. Um, but one thing that we should note is I mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder and I mentioned phobias and fears. Still today, extinction techniques done with exposure are still the best treatments, even for post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. And we will see this again when we get near the end of the course. We'll go over some treatment protocol for both trauma and stress and anxiety disorders, plus phobias, as we will learn about how extinction works and how this occurs. But what this graph right here shows is the what's known as the acquisition phase of classical conditioning. Okay, so this is when the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are paired, and you can see that the strength of the conditioning goes way up. Okay, to where for a good steady amount of time you could then present the conditioned stimulus alone without the unconditioned stimulus. Okay. However, what was found is if you then only compare, you only present the conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned stimulus is no longer paired with it, eventually that behavior will become extinct. Okay, meaning that that association between the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response goes away. Okay. But what we have found, though, is if there's a rest period, so then that conditioned stimulus, you don't see it anymore or you don't hear it. Uh, One day when you're walking around and you hear that sound, that conditioned response will automatically recover for a period of time. Okay. I call this the breakup phenomenon. Okay. So we have two people who are dating, and the associations of love and feelings of giddiness and caring and obsession all get associated with a person. Okay. But then they do something and you guys break up. And then you don't see that person for a long time. And those feelings and those emotions eventually go away. And you no longer associate that person with the feelings of love, caring, blah, blah, blah. Okay. But then let's say you're not exposed to that person anymore. You get rid of all the pictures on your phone and you don't see them around anymore. And so you have this kind of rest period where they don't exist anymore in your world. And then let's say you go to the Bashes or the local grocery store and you run into that individual, and just even if it's just for a moment, you kind of go, "Oh, why did I break up with them? Oh, they're not such a bad person. All those feelings that were associated early in the relationship automatically, spontaneously recover. Okay. Now, hopefully, this is where we hope human cognition takes over and goes, no, 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 that person's bad for you, so you just leave. But this is where, unfortunately, many human beings and kind of go and start that conversation with the person again, and then they have to relearn it all over again. So I kind of use this as an example of how sometimes when we're not exposed to certain stimuluses, such as a past lover or past boyfriend or girlfriend, that sometimes when you run into them, those feelings can spontaneously recover without your permission. So something to consider because one of the things that we're going to learn again later in the course is classical conditioning and operant conditioning don't really happen in the higher cortical areas of the brain. They operate in that limbic, emotional, unconscious area. And that's why sometimes these experiences are kind of sudden to us. And so we have to rationalize them in some way. Okay. So that's classically conditioned. And uh, we will see this, these don't always operate in separation of each other. But let's go on and talk about the next type of learning, which is operant conditioning. Okay. In operant conditioning, as this arrow suggests here, there's an event that occurs in our life and we respond to it behaviorally. Okay. If we are reinforced for it, meaning that we're rewarded for it in some way, that theoretically increases the probability that that behavior will happen in the future. Okay. Theoretically, if we're punished for it, that reduces the probability of the behavior in the future. Okay. Now, this is one area that always kind of really stumps a lot of students, and so I want to make sure we state this up front. You'll notice that reinforcement, there's two types, and punishment, there's two types. Be very careful of the word positive versus negative reinforcement and positive versus negative punishment. Okay. In operant conditioning terms, the term positive means we're adding something to the situation that is reinforcing. Negative reinforcement is when we're taking away something that then is reinforcing to the individual. Okay. And so we'll talk about uh, child tantrums when it comes to these two types of reinforcement here in a minute. But again, also with positive punishment, you're adding something to the situation that is punishing to the individual. So the classical spanking the child or yelling at the child because they did something wrong, you're adding those things to the situation to try and reduce that behavior from occurring again. Negative punishment is you're taking away something. So the proverbial taking your teenager's Xbox away for not being home on curfew on time. Okay. Those are all you're taking away, which is punishing to the individual. Okay. So, but let's go back up here to positive and negative reinforcement. Okay. So we have a child who wants a candy bar. Mom says, no, you can't have that candy bar. That's no, no, no. They're in the store. So the child starts to yell, scream, scream, scream. And what happens? Mom going to give the child the candy bar. Okay. Now, here's the thing. This situation is rewarding for both of them. Okay. The child was positively rewarded because he we'll use a he received a reward for his tantrum behavior. Okay. But mom, let's use mom. Mom was negatively reinforced. for the behavior she did, which was giving the child a candy bar, because it took away the child's tantrum, and that's reinforcing to the child. Okay. And this is partly why extinguishing tantrum behavior is so hard, is because the parent doesn't realize that they are being reinforced and rewarded for their behaviors. So, for example, in some of the studies that kind of shown this is they'll get the child to where the child isn't doing a tantrum behavior. Okay. But what we find is that when mom goes to the marketplace, she will go down that candy aisle 5 times more than she normally would. And she will push her cart close to the candy bar and slow down as she's passing that candy bar. Okay. And so what these studies are showing is that while you've taken care of the child's behavior, that behavior is not going to last long because mom is looking for her reward for that situation. Okay. So there's something to consider when we think about different types of reinforcement, especially when it comes to child's behavior like that. We both have to take care of our reinforced behaviors as well as theirs. Okay. All right. Now, what should we say about positive punishment and negative punishment? This is always part of the course where we talk about things like corporal punishment, spanking, all of those things. Do they work? Do they not work? Research between 2010 to 2020 says no, it's not. It doesn't change behavior, whatever it doesn't. More recent research is actually showing that there might be some benefits to things like spanking, but there's still the studies are kind of while they need to be replicated, there's only been like one or two that are starting to show the positive side of punishment. Okay, but the one thing we do know at this point, and this has been pretty much reinforced in research and research over and over, is that parents really need to have a toolbox of punishment tools. Okay. Because what we have found is that the behavior the child or the boyfriend or the girlfriend commits, the consequence, the punishment that is received has to be equal to that behavior they created or they did. So, for example, um, uh, spanking a child for taking a cookie out of the cookie jar is not going to change the child's cookie stealing behavior. No, what what we find is that they just do it behind mom and dad's back. Okay. So it really doesn't change their behavior. It just makes it so they know not to do that behavior in front of mom or dad. Okay. Um, so having a toolbox of different tools you can use. So what I'm not sure what would be the equivalent punishment for taking a cookie or something like that, but having a toolbox and not just relying on one type of punishment. Okay. Negative punishment, because this is a very common tool in experience, especially for parents with teenagers, is to take something positive away. So that's taking away negative punishment. Okay. And so you tell Bobby, if you're not home by 11, we're going to take your Xbox away and you're grounded for 2 weeks. Okay. Now, most parents in this class probably knows that that doesn't work. If it did for you, I'm very happy for you, but majority of the time, a lot of parents just kind of laugh at that. Okay. And this is the reason. In any type of reinforced behavior with human beings, once you give the element of choice, your reinforcement may or may not happen at all, may or may not have any effect at all. Okay. Because a lot of times people are going to look at their current situation to determine the behaviors that they're going to commit. So, for example, with the teenager who was supposed to be home at 11, I want you to imagine maybe they were at a friend's house and they're getting this really good tasting Kool-Aid in a red plastic cup, and it's making them feel really good. A couple of the girls, remember we called him Bobby, so we're going to go with that. Um, a couple of the girls that he really likes from school are there, and they're paying attention to him. And maybe he's playing a video game with his buddies, and he's doing the best he's ever been. And let's say at around 10:45, he looks at the clock and what decision is he going to make? I should go home. They told me they'd take away my Xbox, or do I stay and continue this amazing fun I'm having and enjoy that? You could probably guess what Bobby decided to do. More likely, he's going to be late from um, curfew. Okay. Why? Because the element of choice was given to Bobby. And this is true against all reinforcement or punishment protocol that you set up with kids, adults, anyone really, is when you give the element of choice, it's not guaranteed that reinforcement and punishment is going to work at all. Indeed, if you were to go pure behaviorist, um, uh, Bobby says, what time do I need to come home? 11. And he asks, well, what will happen if I'm not home on time? Say, you'll find out. And that's where you leave it. In those cases, most of the time, Bobby will usually be home by 11. Um, but that's the kind of idea of element of choice. And I know some parents have tried the whole sticker things, and the kids, if they clean their room and get 5 stickers, they get a pizza, all of those things, and those usually last for about 3 or 4 weeks, and the parent throws it away. Again, when you implement choice, all of these protocols for operant conditioning go out the window. Okay, so if you want to use these, you have to be a little deceptive in that you don't tell the person whether they'll be reinforced or punished for something. You just let the behaviors happen naturally and then decide what to do from that point. Okay. All right. Here's some examples of, again, the positive and negative reinforcement. I believe these are in your textbook. If you need some more examples, you turn in your homework on time, your teacher praises you, you increase turning in your homework on time. So here there was the introduction of praise. So again, positive, adding something to. You turn your homework in on time, teacher stops, it's taking away, stops criticizing late work. So you increase turning in your homework on time. So those are some examples of the difference between positive and negative. Okay. All right. And then the last thing that we really should talk about when it comes to operant conditioning is schedules of reinforcement. Okay. And we'll start with the term interval versus ratio. Okay. Ratio means the number of times the person commits a behavior. So it's based on the number of times someone does something. Interval is based on time, not the number of times someone does something. Okay. And so you'll see that the variable ratio is the best way to get a behavior learned or for someone to achieve quick learning. Okay. Fixed interval tends to be kind of the less example. Okay. And in between, we have fixed ratio, which means that the person is given a reward every so many times they commit a behavior. Okay. So maybe it's every time they get a reward. Okay. Variable ratio, you never know when you're going to be rewarded. It might be 5 times, it might be 1 time, it might be 3 times, it may be 20 times, but you never really know when you're going to get rewarded. Okay. Variable interval is time, it maybe this week, maybe next week, you never know, maybe a day from now, but you never know based on the behaviors you're committing when you're going to actually receive it. Okay. And then fixed interval is that you get a reward every certain amount of time. Okay. Some examples of this fixed intervals are a good example of a person's paycheck. Okay. So let's say you get paid every 2 weeks. What we find is, and we'll start right here, what we find is after payday, people's performance at work kind of slacks. And then just a few days before payday, so maybe the second week, their behaviors or their performance increases. And then they get paid and their pay and their performance flattens for a week. And then the week before the paycheck, it increases. Okay, so it creates kind of this scalloped look. Okay. A variable interval might be something like some common things we might experience in relationships. Maybe you're one of those person that expresses your love all the time to that person. So you're always saying I love you every morning. Let's say you say I love you. But maybe your partner isn't so consistent about saying I love you. Okay? So you'll have a steady performance. You won't stop because you'll be looking for that next time that the person will do that behavior. Okay? Now let's go to variable ratio. Variable ratio is slot machines and gambling. And if you're wondering why gambling and things are so addictive, it's because it's on this type of uh, reward and punishment reward system. Because you never know when the next reward is going to happen, you become fixated on trying to continue and look for that next behavior. So you'll keep pulling that slot thing down until that reward. And then you're like, well, I don't know when the next reward will be. And so you continue to do that again and again because it's not predictable. You get stuck in this mindset, well, it might be the next time. This is the basis of the lottery. This is the basis of gambling and casinos, is this variable ratio system that keeps people behaving and putting their money in a machine until that is paid off somehow. Okay. So these are just some examples of different reinforcement things and how they kind of work. Okay. Okay. So the last type of learning that we're going to get through for tonight is observational learning, also known as social learning. And so if you see the word observational, that it can be exchanged for the word social learning as well. Okay. And these are kind of the rules of it, right? Remember what we said Monday before fall break in social learning. We attend to different behaviors, retain all the way the behaviors are committed, and then we produce them ourselves, and the behavior that best represents or best reinforces us then stays. We continue doing that behavior. And again, this is one of the reasons humans are so adaptable to a lot of environments and situations. Um, is because of this ability to adapt a behavior to a given situation. Okay. And I had mentioned that the best example of the person who studied the observation or social learning was Albert Bandura. Okay, and in the Bobo doll experiments. And again, just kind of as a reminder, if you don't know what a Bobo doll is, it's kind of a tall, slender balloon thing that looks kind of usually they look like a clown. They have a weight at the bottom, so if you knock the balloon over, it will come right back up. Okay. And in the Bobo doll experiments, what Bandura did is he randomly assigned children to one of two conditions in the first day. Okay. Either they watched a teacher very aggressively hit and slap and throw a Bobo doll as she was trying to put it up, or the child either then watched a teacher who just put the Bobo doll up normally without any aggression. And the question was, is what does the child do the next day? Do they act aggressively or not aggressively based on what they observed the day before? Okay. And here's kind of a little short clip on it. We'll just kind of watch this really quick. Okay. Maybe.
The model pummeled the doll with the mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, threw it down, and beat it. It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language.
Okay, so from that video, what I hope you kind of picked up from it is the modeling of behavior, but also that the child didn't necessarily mimic what the teacher did. If you notice, the little boy was playing with a toy gun and being aggressive with the toy gun. And this was observed, I do have to say this straight out, this was observed in both boys and girls, even though girls tended not to get the toy gun out as much. They tended to use more of the physical and verbal aggression than the boys did. Um, and so here we have this situation, and this is probably what you probably read on psychology.com websites and in popular media is you so we had a child with an aggressive behavior, a child who observed a non-aggressive behavior, and then if you've listened to popular media, it said that the child who modeled the aggressive teacher was more aggressive the next day, and the child who didn't model who had a non-aggressive model was less aggressive. They weren't as aggressive as the other child. However, this is actually only half the story because this experiment was actually what is known as a 2 by 2 design. Okay, meaning that there was two conditions the first day and two conditions the child was in the second day. So let's look at this from this perspective. So, day one, a child was either exposed to a non-aggressive model or an aggressive model. In day two, they then were randomly assigned to again to either be with an aggressive model or a non-aggressive model. And this is kind of what complicates the idea that just purely observing aggression increases aggression. Okay. Because if a child was had an aggressive model on day one and an aggressive model on day two, their aggressive behavior was actually low. It wasn't almost non-existent. They were not aggressive at all. Okay. However, if the child observed a teacher that was aggressive in day one, but a teacher who was non-aggressive in day two, their aggression went up. Okay. And again, when we look at non-aggressive in day one, but aggressive in day two, the children's aggression went up. Okay. Versus non-aggressive, non-aggressive, their aggression was low. So this is what complicates this story a lot more. Um, I will say that if you've ever taking in a foster child that came from a violent home, and and you have this assumption that by putting them in that safe environment that they will just magically not become aggressive and become a really good kid, but you put them in that home and they are aggressive and hurtful and harming. This is kind of why. Okay. Um, I will tell you, when I worked in a women and children's uh, uh, shelter as the shelter manager, I can't tell you how many times I was urinated on, hit, kicked, slapped, bitten by a kiddo that came from a very aggressive environment and now is in a non-aggressive environment. Okay. And yes, a lot of those behaviors tend to be what's known as testing behaviors, especially in younger children. If we look at again the non-aggressive and they're put with an aggressive model, then of course their behavior, because it's almost like giving them permission to at that point. Whereas if the environment is consistent, you'll notice in these two environments, consistency produce no aggression. Okay. So the Bobo doll experiment is a little bit more complicated than if you just expose a child to aggression, they'll be aggressive. Because in some situations they won't, especially if that aggressiveness continues versus that. And I will tell you this current state of research on does viewing violent TV cause aggression, da da da. The research currently set actually is showing that it's not actually the level of aggression that a child is exposed to, but the level of competition. So, for example, in one experiment, they had age-appropriate teens do the Call of Duty thing, that first shooter one, and other ones did Madden football. Okay, and they actually found that it was the kids that played Madden were more aggressive for up to 72 hours than the kids who played Call of Duty. And what it came down to is the amount of competition within that sports game versus Call of Duty. So something to think about when you're thinking about the games and everything that you expose your children to. It seems to be that higher levels of competition increase aggression, not necessarily the amount of violence that the child is witnessing or the teen is witnessing. Kind of interesting stuff that is coming out of that literature. All right, so we went through our three types of learning. Okay. Um, and they're just one thing to keep in mind is that they all do work together. At the same time, we're classically conditioned. We can be doing operant conditioning and even social learning. It is much more complex than that. There's these three ways of learning, and each one has its separate thing. Um, but I want to kind of end the learning section with kind of this analogy about learning. If you want to kind of think about how complex it is, really, when it comes down to it, is if I were to ask you to go and get into your car, you'd probably say that that's one continuous decision. But if I actually asked you to count every single decision you made to get in your car and buckle your seatbelt and put your key in the ignition, you should come up with anywhere between 450 and to 700 different individuals' decisions that you make just getting into your car. And that's the complexity of learning. Um, and why sometimes learning is very hard to change in the example of gambling and addiction, and sometimes can be lifelong issues for people to try and correct. Okay. But I just wanted to bring that up. So, where are we going to go this Wednesday? This Wednesday, we're going to talk about the next level of experience, which is memory. And how does memory work? And how does it contribute to behavior and our mental processes? Mainly, we'll be looking at things like decision making and problem solving when it comes to the memory system. So I'm going to stop my sharing here. I'm going to